50 years ago, if somebody walks into a church, they're asking, how can I believe this is true? Today, they're walking into a church and saying, how do I know I'm safe? And It comes down to a power issue.
Hi, I'm Glenn from Speak Life. We like to see all things through the lens of Jesus. Today, I am joined by Mark Meynell. Hello, Mark.
Hey, Glenn, nice to see you.
Yeah, really nice to be with you. We've spoken a couple of times, I think, on the channel, and one of the things we constantly are talking about, not only with you, but with many people on the channel, is church leadership, power, authority, and its use in the church, and its misuse in the church. And you've just... together with Mark Stirling, you've edited a new book called Not So With You, Power and Leadership for the Church. And I wanted to commend you on your use of prepositions. I think in that subtitle, Power and Leadership for the Church. That's a really interesting use of a preposition. Tell me why you think power and leadership is for the church.
Well, I'm glad you picked up that point, because we talked quite a bit about how to phrase it. There's a trend and a nervousness about power and authority generally in the culture and in the church, and that is legitimate in many ways. But both Mark and I were convinced that this is something that God gives to his church for the flourishing of the church. An illustration I've come back to, I read a while back, is imagine if there was an orchestra in the Garden of Eden. So before the fall, and there's a full symphony orchestra, that orchestra would still need a conductor, even in the paradise of the garden.
Right.
Let's imagine they're playing a sort of Mahler symphony, which you just cannot do without somebody with a baton. There's a sense in which every member of the orchestra is playing to the best of their ability and flourishing within the bigger whole under the leadership of a conductor who is serving them through their leadership. And that is a gift. And so our hope and certainly our conviction from the scriptures is that authority, that power is a neutral thing that can be used for good and ill. And the issue is not to just avoid it, but to use it well.
Right.
And Jesus, I think, gets right to that point, which is where the phrase "not so with you" comes from. It's from Matthew 10, and Jesus is talking about the contrast between Gentile leaders and "not so with you." You're to be like a servant leader.
And therefore, it's power and leadership for the church. It's a good thing that the conductor is there for the sake of the orchestra. Take us through different ways that can go wrong. So you could have an orchestra that does not have a conductor, or you could have a harsh authoritarian conductor who does not get the best out of his or her musicians. So tell me about those two dangers.
Well, yes, I suppose you could say there's the one who abdicates from authority, and there is chaos, and there's factions, there are tensions, and sometimes you need somebody to sort of separate out some of those things and get to the heart of things, to be a sort of third party when there are tensions or whatever going on within the body. But then there's the authoritarian that runs everything through fear, and of course there have been conductors like that, and there's certainly been church leaders like that. So that maybe people are serving well, and they're really giving all they've got, and maybe the end result on the surface looks amazing. So you can go to these places where there is a very authoritarian leader, and you sit there on a Sunday, and it's an incredibly slick, impressive, dynamic environment, and you think, wow, there's a lot going on here, this is a happening place. But what you don't see under the surface is that people are cowering in fear, and they're driven by all kinds of anxieties and threats, and that is profoundly unchristian. Perfect love drives out fear, but you don't see that in some of these authoritarian contexts. Perfect fear has driven out love almost.
Gosh, okay. So tell me about that. Tell me, you've written a book about power and leadership. There are other books about power and leadership in the church that are out there. Why this book, and why now?
So Mark and I have known each other for a few years, not that long, but we've done the odd thing together. And I was up staying with him in Scotland. It was before COVID, and we were just sort of musing one evening and just chatting about the situations in Scotland and England in terms of churches we were aware of. And we were very conscious of some of these scandals that were beginning to emerge. But both of us were aware of one or two situations that long predated the publicity of those scandals. It was also around that time and since a number of books have come out, mainly from the States and mainly from people who are psychologists with a theological bent, as it were, people who are bringing their psychology, their psychiatry to serve the church, and they've been amazing. So there are a few names, Chuck de Groot, Diane Langberg, and Kurt Thompson, and one or two others. And both of us would say that they have been remarkably influential in shaping how we think about this, because we hadn't really had to do much, go in much depth before. But I think we were conscious that because they were not theologians in the strict sense, they certainly are in the real sense, because they're believers who engage with Scripture and apply that to their professional fields. But because there are skeptics around in some of our churches who dismiss this kind of talk as just it's just a bandwagon, it's just a worldly agenda being imposed on the church, or whatever it is, they will just assume that because these guys, their starting point is their psychiatry or their psychology, that therefore we don't really need to engage or listen to them. Then we have a problem, because actually what they are tapping into is stuff that the Bible's been talking about for centuries. And so we wanted to make sure that not that we're jumping on a bandwagon, but that we're saying there is profound theological, biblical, historical precedent, at foundations, if you like, for engaging with this stuff. And so we wanted to get a whole range of other voices to talking about it.
Give us a taste of some of the theology that you're applying to this situation of power and leadership in the church, and give us a flavour for some of the voices that are speaking into this in the book.
So we deliberately sought out some biblical theologians, New Testament, Old Testament, one or two historians, one or two systematicians, people in ministry, people in leadership with their own personal experiences, sometimes obviously a combination. We wanted it to be quite international, and we wanted it to be a genuine mix of men and women. With all these things, you have your aspirations at the beginning, and not everything comes together. Sometimes editing a book and getting people in is a bit like herding cats. But we're very glad with the people we got. There were a few others that maybe we might sort of in time do a backup website with some of the others that didn't come through. But we were trying to say, hey, look, this isn't a problem specific to a particular theological position. It's not a problem to a particular social class or context. So, some of the scandals in this country, in England, in contrast, say, to Scotland, have been revolved around sort of upper middle class white Brits who went to private school. But we've certainly tried to show that is not exclusive to that group. I came across some of this stuff as a teacher in a seminary in Uganda over 20 years ago. I was noticing some of these trends then. So that was immediately obvious. This is not a white upper middle class thing. It's a human thing. We've got one or two testimonies of people who have suffered because of this. That was important to get their voices in. So as much as we could, it's a range, but there's always room for more in the future, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there is something to be said for a diverse range, especially in terms of men and women speaking into this situation. I do remember we had Philippa Wilson, who's been on this channel as well, and she reflected to me that while she was an undergraduate, one of the more notorious of the UK church pastors who have fallen from grace in the last decade happened to come and give us a talk at her Christian Union, and she was tasked with taking him out to Pizza Express beforehand, and she just said, within 30 seconds I knew he was a misogynist. Within 30 seconds I knew it, I saw it, and I just think our sisters in Christ have such a spidey sense for these things that can just pass blokes by.
Totally. Absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, and so, getting that range of voices, and that's definitely something you've sought to do with this book. Tell me about some of the doctrines, because you've got biblical theologians, and you've got people like Christopher Wright talking about Old Testament, and talking about Ezekiel and shepherds and that sort of thing. But you've also got systematic theologians talking about Trinity and union with Christ and things like that. Like what does the doctrine of the Trinity have to do with power and leadership for the church?
The premise to begin with was that all truth is integrated, and so it doesn't matter whether you're coming to it from a biblical theologian point of view or a systematics or a historical or whatever. Everything is integrated and everything has its outworking, and so a Trinitarian understanding, and I'm very conscious that I'm out of my depth here. I'm by no means a systematician, which is why I didn't go near some of those issues in terms of the nitty-gritty. But there's clear resonance in terms of how the Godhead relates each person to the others, and while there are definitely controversies about how one can apply those, there's no question that the quality of relationships that you see within the Godhead must have their impact on a God-fearing, godly way of going about life. And so the particular chapter you're thinking of for that is by Jared Mickelson, who's a pastor up in St Andrews. He did his PhD in St Andrews. And I think it's fascinating because what he does, the title is Confessions of a Potential Authoritarianism, Knowing the Trinity as Antidote to Pastoral Authoritarianism. There's a beautiful combination there of very honest reflection and a deep dive into, heavy theological waters, and he does a beautiful job there, I think.
Yes, yeah, and he navigates the waters of the Twitter debates of 2017 brilliantly, and
Yes.
comes out on quite. So if people are worried that, oh my goodness, he's just talking about eternal functional subordination of the Son and all that, he's not at all. He's talking about the inimitable triune God in all sorts of ways, and imitating God as creatures. And as a very careful theologian, he nevertheless draws out the intertrinitarian life in a really refreshing way, and lands it with some Hannah Arendt as well, which is glorious. We'll get to your chapter in a second, Mark, because I think the Imago Dei stuff is right at the heart of both why we need to talk about power and why it's difficult to talk about power in this cultural moment. And I think that's really important. But I think Grant McCaskill's chapter on symbolic capital and the dynamics of leadership really resonated with me, and he's basically going to the Apostle Paul, where in Philippians 3 he says, I consider all my former life as a Pharisee as dung, or however you want to translate that, worthless compared to the surpassing greatness of knowing Christ. And he sort of brings that sort of biblical theological category into conversation with this idea of symbolic capital. Can you explain what symbolic capital is and why it's important to know about it?
I mean, the Philippians background is really crucial. Philippians 3. I think that is an absolutely fascinating chapter, and it's I suppose a simplistic shorthand is that it's all the kind of stuff we rely on for our sense of identity, position in a group or a subculture, all the things that give us credibility. So he talks about his own updating of Philippians 3 on page 94, and in a particular Scottish context, he says, I was idolatrous in the worst of ways because I thought I was being faithful. In between my moments of undeniable sin, I was an evangelical of evangelicals, in the tribe of Knox, as to zeal, a defender of all evangelical truth claims, and a tender of all services. As to doctrine, faultless, in my own mind at least. Yet over time I've come to see that the most basic problem I had was the way I thought about myself. I'd not really come to terms with the implications of the gospel for who I identified myself to be, although this was a big part of my reformed theological heritage. This affected all of my piety, all of my relationships, and all of my service. I think that's an incredible paragraph.
It is. He didn't have a go at he didn't have a go at translating Scubalon, though, did he? But you could translate that into any setting, and I'm an Anglican of Anglicans, or I was confirmed by Bishop Bell, or whatever it is.
Exactly right. Yeah. So it's all the kind of stuff in our sort of mental furniture we lean back on, even if nobody else is aware of it, and it's the kind of thing, I guess you could say. It's the kind of thing in the back of your mind, even if you never utter these words, it's the kind of thing where you're thinking, don't you know who I am? And I remember reading somewhere, someone said, how do you know if you're a servant leader? Well, you know it how you behave when you're treated like one.
Go on, say that again. So I would know that I'm a servant leader when I serve others, or what's the...
Yes, but when you're treated like a servant, a slave, and how you respond to that.
Yes, exactly.
Which is agony, because I want to say, don't you know who I am?
Yes.
But then of all the people who must have thought that in his mind was Jesus. The whole of his ministry, I guess in the back of his mind, he resisted the temptation to think this because he was holy, but... all the time he could have been saying, don't you know who I am? Because the whole point is, who are you?
Yes. And so I remember, Richard Buse at All Souls, so he was not rector when you were there, was he?
No, he just after I started just after he left.
Yes, started just after. But yeah, he always said that, ministry is probably 80% putting away the chairs. That's basically what it is, and kind of so much of pastoral ministry is just that. Being treated like a servant, and what a glory that is,
and getting on with it.
Yeah, well, and treat it as the glory that it is in Mark chapter 10 terms, where the not so with you comes from, because it's the rulers of the Gentiles that lord it over others. So take us then to the image of God. This is something you've done quite a lot of work on, Mark. First of all, tell us where your journey began with really pressing into, I'm going to use a fancy Latin phrase, the imago Dei, and what set you on that trajectory, and then we'll think about how it applies to this situation.
Well, that was the result of an invitation. So there was Oak Hill College runs an annual School of Theology day, and they were doing a day about Imago Dei, about being made in the image of God, and they asked me to do it on power. So actually that was the prompt, really. It wasn't one that I suddenly thought, oh yeah, that's where that's going. But I'd been engaging with some of this stuff for ages. So my book Wilderness of Mirrors, that came out in 2015, which took me 5 years. There's far too much in it, and I think I would do it very differently if I was doing it now. But in the end, where that was going was saying that the people today are suspicious as a culture for a whole host of different reasons. But at the heart of it is because they've had their fingers burnt, they've experienced the abuse of power at all kinds of levels, the sort of geopolitical right down to the personal and pastoral. And so no wonder you're suspicious. That would be that's a natural response. So I guess I've been looking at issues of power and victims of power abuse. So it was the prompt to look at it for Oak Hill. But once I was set down that train, it was very natural. And I think one of the key things that really helped me was C.S. Lewis's brilliant sermon, The Weight of Glory, where he talks about what a difference it makes if we recognize that every person around us is a potential angel, and sees them through God's eyes, and the temptation would be to worship them, not abuse or ignore them. And that's the sort of redemption end of the line. But the other end of the line is our createdness. And something that as evangelicals we're really bad at is really sort of going into a deep dive on being created. And we tend to start with original sin, but original sin makes no sense if there's not original goodness and original createdness. And the createdness is never removed. The goodness is never obliterated. It's distorted and damaged. But, we are not the devils of hell. We are made in the image of God, and we don't lose that. It is ruined and disfigured. But once we get that, then suddenly you cannot look at a single other human being without recognizing the profound things you have in common. And that affects all ethics. It affects every aspect of human interaction, both personal, corporate, global, you name it. And that is the central premise. And so one of the things I look at is the abolitionists. And it's fascinating. Once I started doing just basic Google searches on abolitionist speeches and stuff, the Imago Dei comes up all the time, because of course it does. And actually the pro-slavers were wanting to deny that. They say, no, they are not. They are just beasts, which is an appalling way. But the thing is, in the 20th century, that is an all too familiar line. The people you despise or want to get rid of, you dehumanize. Yes. But that's what power abuse does.
Yes. So it has been a precious doctrine all throughout the last thousands of years as we've meditated on Genesis 1 and the Imago Dei. You also really helpfully in this chapter talk about 5 impediments, or why many evangelicals just don't want to get it, don't want to go there. Why is the language around power and actually honouring and valuing the other, why is that a difficult conversation to have in our cultural moment?
There are a range of reasons. I think one is around the world, particularly in the West, people are shouting through megaphones from the streets about this kind of stuff. And the church is naturally and rightly nervous about just picking up on a trend or even a thrust that's coming from the world and telling us stuff, because we assume we're the ones to tell the world how they should live. We're very reluctant to let the world tell the church how to live, and there are good reasons for that. But sometimes we have to acknowledge that actually we are behind, and some people are tapping into things that actually, in a prophetic way, are God sent. And maybe God is using outsiders to really give the church a shake and say, hang on, you're not looking at this. Now, there are all kinds of alarm bells and danger signals with that. Just as some of the things being shouted through megaphones are not the kinds of things that we're very comfortable with or want to just fully endorse. But if there are things that are being shouted out from outside that you find were already there in Scripture, you've got to say, oh, hang on a minute.
Yeah.
We've lost something here. So, a little pet theory I have is that since the Enlightenment, we've spent, as a church, playing catch up with all the assaults on truth. And that's necessary. How can you believe this stuff? And so we're fighting back philosophically, with evidence, history, blah blah blah, and we don't stop doing that. The truth questions haven't disappeared, but I think we've kind of overlooked the related question of power. Who has power? Who decides what you believe? And it's not simply the assent to what something is true, because actually sometimes you've got to ask the question, well, what power does the person asserting this truth have over you? And that's what the postmodernists have been really pushing back for the last 100 years, well, since Nietzsche more. And you talked about that in the air that we breathe, and this kind of stuff is just in the ether. But actually, I suppose in a crude way, you could sum it up saying, well, 50 years ago, if somebody walks into a church, they're asking, how can I believe this is true? Today, they're walking into a church and saying, how do I know I'm safe? And it comes down to a power issue.
Yeah.
Because are they going to abuse my children? Are they going to take my identity away? Am I going to give all my money away? Am I going to have to, all this sort of stuff? And you hear horror stories of churches and cults and all that stuff. So people's questions are legitimate, but they're power questions, sociological questions perhaps, rather than philosophical. And so we are not as well equipped to engage with that. I think we've got a good heritage with dealing with truth. We've not really dealt with power.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, one thing that strikes me, it might be a bit of a tangent, is that I think a lot of people worry whether they're safe anywhere. And yes,
I agree.
They have very good reason to ask that question about church and historic abuse cases, and there are very good reasons why they might ask that question of church. But I think there is, a desire for everyone to be safe, and a lack of trust in any institution whatsoever, and handing over control to any institution, which I guess all of us have to deal with. But you mentioned about postmodernism, because I guess that is a really big reason why it's difficult to have this conversation about power theologically, because it's a culture war battle. And, we know what people say in the culture wars, and, one side, if one side even says, can we take care of the little guy just for once? The other side say, you're all into power dynamics. It's all just postmodernism. And there's a sort of an anti-woke kind of club that is used to beat anything. And even if you bring scriptures, and even if you're talking to a Christian, there's a kind of there's been a woke versus anti-woke kind of culture war. How on earth do we navigate that and actually bring the scriptures to bear into that kind of maelstrom?
Oh man, that's such a tricky one. One needs, this is a sort of, innocent as doves situation. We need to be canny, and a bit stealthy, not sort of manipulative or dishonest, obviously, because that just falls into the precise trap. But I think this is actually where a faithful expository approach, I think, is really crucial, because what you're trying to do, let's say you're preaching on the early chapters of 1 Corinthians. I think they are really important for this whole issue. In fact, the 2 Corinthian letters I keep coming back to. Ever since my curacy, 25 years ago I was ordained, and I've come back to it and keep on thinking, actually, those first 4 chapters of 1 Corinthians, indeed the whole letter, but those first 4 particularly, it's not that they were irrelevant before, but it really feels like this is their time, because there are so many things there that you don't have to work hard at all to see what they're speaking into. The whole obsession with the superficial and the appearance of things rather than the reality, power and influence, being wise, all this sort of stuff, and that the cross subverts it all, and that we speak foolishness and weakness, all this sort of stuff is there. And so in a sense, my job as the preacher is to get out of the way, not to sort of press political buttons or blow dog whistles, but just to let what those passages are saying come out, so that people come away thinking not, Mark is just on a soapbox, but isn't it amazing that how Paul got there first? Or Philippians 2. That Philippians 2 is a key chapter for the whole of this book. It comes back in a number of the essays. Your mind should not be verging on or remotely resembling or whatever. It should be the same as Christ, who did not use the authority, the status, the power of eternity in heaven to be exploited, but he became nothing, a servant, dead. You can't get much clearer than that. If that's not woke, then I don't know what is, in a way. It's about saying you love people to the death, including those that are unlovely and unlovable.
Yes.
The weakest.
Yeah. And there are all sorts of things that I think we can say that are just thoroughly biblical, but that might trigger either the woke or the anti-woke. And we've just got to be more robustly biblical about it and just say, well, it might sound woke, it might sound anti-woke. That's because that culture war is... these are peoples divorced and detached from the Christian story that are hurling Bible verses at each other, right? And so no wonder what I say at some times will sound like them, and at other times it'll sound like the other. I was in a heated discussion last night about Old Testament law and sabbaticals, right? And I was just, they didn't glean all the way to the edge of their fields, and they didn't harvest all the way to the edge of their fields so that they could allow space for gleaning. And they would tell newly married, husbands, you don't have to fight this year. And they would take one day off a week, and they would take 1 year off in 7. Oh my goodness. And they just weren't about maximizing. And it was a profoundly equalizing thing, I said, because it wasn't just the clergy, it wasn't just the Levites that get this. It's like everybody got this. And my friend was just like, that sounds like communism. And it was just like, and he was just triggered by, that reminds me of, a much more modern kind of political, statement. And like in the discussion, I was like, I don't know, maybe it does, but I'm not really trying to be more Marxist.
I know plenty of people who grew up under communism.
Yeah.
Well, that's right. And you talk to some of them, and you think, no, it doesn't. But I think one person who's helpful for this discussion is I think you've had him, is Chris Watkin in his book Biblical Critical Theory, because his idea, I think he pushes it sort of slightly too far, maybe, because he does it everywhere. But the whole diagonalization idea that you're neither one thing nor the other if you're biblical, you find a path through by seeing what actually relates to scriptures. You're starting with the scriptures, not with the political agenda.
Yes. And to bring this right back to kind of the concerns of this book, to care for victims and to be extremely sensitive to victims is not to buy into the sociological phenomenon of competitive victimhood. Necessarily. I think you can both affirm...
It might,
but there is such a thing as competitive victimhood, but if you're being scriptural, it's not that. But there can be a good and proper attention and sensitivity to victims.
So the abuse of something, a principle, is not an excuse to avoid the use of it, which is a key basic principle dating back centuries. So just because something gets ruined by how people use it doesn't mean to say you avoid it altogether.
The book sort of begins theologically and very richly and profoundly theologically, but then there is this lovely kind of interlude where from Mark Stirling he kind of does the anti-beatitudes, which I thought were just lovely. I think everybody should read these. Those who are full of themselves,
does a good job.
Miserable are those who are full of themselves because they're disqualified from the kingdom of heaven. Miserable are those who are complacent and at ease with things as they are because they forfeit true comfort. Miserable are those who are self-assertive, self-confident, and demand and get their rights because that's all they'll get and they'll lose everything that really matters. Miserable are those who are content with conforming to behavioral standards that confer social status because they will be empty inside. Miserable are those who demand justice of others and are highly critical of them because they will find that others treat them the same way. Miserable are those whose hearts are full of selfish and self-centered desires for pleasure and gain because the true God is ever hidden from them. Miserable are those who create division and dissension and are proud of their tribal belonging because there is no place for them in the kingdom of heaven. Miserable are those who get celebrated, praised, and famous, because that's all they'll get. That packs a punch,
Ouch.
doesn't it? Yeah.
It does indeed.
So, yeah, a very sobering kind of interlude. And then in the second half of the book, you talk about the experiences of people. Why is it important to talk at that more practical level?
The first half sounds more theoretical, but it isn't. It's deeply embedded in reality and experience. But I think we need to hear from people who can then say, well, this is how it affected me, or this is how I engaged with it. And so it literally is the second half of the book. It is almost exactly 50%. And it's a combination of people who have suffered. So I think Blythe Sizemore's chapter called the Cost of Brokenness is heartbreaking, as is Sushila Ailawadi. She's from India, talking about the abuse of women by men, particularly in an Indian context, but it transfers, is really significant and important. But then it's also, well, here are some people who get the issue, but then are thinking, okay, well, look, I do have this responsibility, I do have this role to be a mentor. So Marcus Honeysett speaks about mentoring. He's doing this full time now with his Living Leadership sort of team. So he's really thought deep about this, and of course he's got a book about powerful leaders too. So there's a range of people who are saying, okay, so but this is what it needs to look like, and this is how we. It's not definitive, and it's by no means a straitjacket, but it's saying, as I think about the people I relate to and lead and mentor and serve, these are some of the things I'm going to have to do, or this is something I've really got to avoid. And I think that's really helpful. Having these different voices will put things across our bows that you think, oh, I'd never thought of that before. Tasha Chapman, who's a professor in the States, she talks about a whole perspective of being a woman on boards and committees and things, and it comes from her particular denominational context, which might be different from others. But she's at least saying, well, this is how you need to be thinking. It doesn't mean that you do the same stuff in practice, but it just raises the question. So I think it's more, the second half is a sort of provocation, probably. These are things, ways to consider, and it probably needs a whole other book for ways in which this is provoked.
Tell me about a few different readers who are reading this book. Who do you hope gets it into their hands, and what do you hope they get from the book?
I think inevitably an anthology of essays by all kinds of different people. So we got people from the UK, US, from India, are going to relate to different things. And there are one or two essays that are definitely more academic and sort of in depth with footnotes and everything else. And then there are others that are more testimony, personal. There's a whole range. I think in principle, I would love it if those who are skeptical about this whole area of discussion and very fearful for where it leads, and maybe the kinds of questions that people are asking in churches and their leaders. Leaders are definitely in the firing line for all kinds of reasons. So there's an understandable nervousness. I would hope that this would be a useful way of navigating that and saying, okay, look, there are some things we really must take seriously. And then there are other things where we can say, no, well, that isn't an agenda of the church. That isn't something that is fair or legitimate. And so hopefully this can be a map for navigating between those things. I think anybody, and that could be for anybody who has concerns, whether as someone who has suffered or perhaps perceives it going on in their church. But I would hope that people in leadership, whether elders or, church wardens in an Anglican setting or whatever, would definitely spend some time looking at this and then following up threads, because there's a lot of ways in which this could lead to other study. Because I think it's about being responsible in our roles. Ignorance is not an excuse anymore, because there's so many things going wrong, and it's not just about avoiding scandal. It's not just about making sure your name or your church doesn't end up in the papers.
Yes.
It's actually saying, okay, well, we've all got things to learn here. My track record is by no means perfect. I've made a lot of mistakes, and I've apologized to people. I'm sure there are other people I need to apologize to, and we're not talking about perfection here, but it's saying, if I take my role seriously and I seek to be godly and Christ-like in it, then I need to face up to uncomfortable things. I need to see what my own shadow sides are, where my own particular temptations and pitfalls lie, and then do something about this. And this, again, may be a way of identifying. So you might be reading something and think, oh, okay, so actually maybe I did do that. And it's, completely unwitting, perhaps. You don't even realise it. But that's why we need other voices, because we're blind to things. So I would say it's anybody who wants to take Christian leadership responsibly that this is for.
Well, I do hope that this gets picked up and read by many other people. I will ask you one more question just after the break, and that will be for subscribers to the channel. And you can find out more about how to be a subscriber to the channel in just a second. But Mark, I will ask you that one extra question in just a second. But for the rest of the channel, how can people get hold of this book, and how can people get hold of you?
So it's on Amazon, but it's a crazy price on Amazon. I'm selling them on my own little bookshop for half the price. It's called inklingsbooks.co.uk, and I've got a few copies there. And you can find me on my blog. I'm not very frequent these days because I'm doing too many things. I'm sort of juggling too many balls, but markmeynell.net.
Fantastic. And yes, sock it to the big guy, Amazon. Go and buy the book from Inklings.
Let's undercut Amazon so that I can build my own rockets.
Brilliant. Mark Meynell, thank you so much for joining me.
Absolute pleasure.